In our previous video, looking at Charlotte Bronte's novel Jane Eyre, we examined the way that Jane needs to learn to impose self-restraint on her passionate interior life, or risk being labeled as insane. And in fact, her acting out as a child does get her institutionalized in a charity school, Lowood School, where, at least initially, her life is much worse than it had been at Gateshead. She only gains control of her life at Lowood when she learns from Helen Burns the power of self-restraint and adopts from Miss Temple a calm and restrained exterior life. But nevertheless, the interior life of Jane is still an essential element of her personality and one that she treasures. And her task throughout the novel will be maintaining a balance between her passionate interior life and the exterior self-restraint that allows her to control how she's seen by others. Now, this self-restraint is going to be directly attacked by Rochester in an attempt to, as he says, let the restrained bird free. But Jane understands that letting that restrained bird free will turn her into Bertha Mason, and so she has to maintain that balance between self-control and a lively, active, passionate interior life. But in the next section of the novel, we're going to be looking at Jane's repressed but still very active, passionate interior, and also at why it becomes so necessary to keep that passionate interior controlled. In the novel, after the typhoid epidemic manages to kill off Helen Burns and many of the other students, and as a result, Lowood School is reorganized and rebuilt as a more effective and actively charitable institution, Jane goes on not only to become a student, but actually a teacher at the school. And during her time at the school as a teacher, she's under the influence of Miss Temple. However, Miss Temple eventually gets married and leaves the school, and with Miss Temple goes Jane's sense of being settled. On page 31, in the right-hand column, after Miss Temple leaves, Jane's repression starts to fail her, and she starts to express an interest in some wider horizon. From the day she left, I was no longer the same. With her was gone every settled feeling, every association that had made Lowood in some degree a home to me. I had imbibed from her some of her nature and much of her habits, more harmonious thoughts. What seemed better regulated feelings had become the inmates of my mind. I had given allegiance to duty and order. I was quiet. I believed. I was content. To the eyes of others, usually even to my own, I appeared a disciplined and subdued character. Now, we need to pay attention to how Jane describes her dual personality here. What seemed better regulated feelings had become the inmates of my mind. She seems to be more ordered and better regulated. I believed, which implies that she wasn't actually content. To the eyes of others, usually even to my own, I appeared a disciplined and subdued character. But of course, this is the external appearance only, and that Jane that we talked about at the beginning of the last video, who combines a passionate interior life with a subdued exterior, is quite clear here. The dual nature of her character becomes quite clear. As a result, she says, after Miss Temple leaves, I had undergone a transforming process, that my mind had put off all it had borrowed of Miss Temple, or rather that she had taken with her the serene atmosphere I had been breathing in her vicinity, and that now I was left in my natural element and beginning to feel the stirring of old emotions. And so the old passionate Jane is starting to show up again. Now I felt that it was not enough. I tired of the routine of 8 years in one afternoon. I desired liberty. For liberty I gasped. For liberty I uttered a prayer. It seemed scattered on the wind then faintly blowing. I abandoned it and framed a humbler supplication for change, stimulus. That petition too seemed swept off into vague space. Then I cried, half desperate, grant me at least a new servitude. Skip down just a little bit. A new servitude. There is something in that, I soliloquized. Mentally, be it understood, I did not talk aloud. She wants to make sure we understand that she's not actually crazy. I know there is, because it does not sound too sweet. It is not such words as liberty, excitement, enjoyment. Delightful sounds truly, but no more than sounds for me, and so hollow and fleeting that it is a mere waste of time to listen to them. But servitude, that must be a matter of fact. Anyone may serve. I have served here 8 years. Now all I want is to serve elsewhere. Can I not get so much of my own will? And so she determines in this passage that what she really wants is some form of freedom. But given her social and economic status, she doesn't have freedom available to her. So the best she can hope for is a form of service somewhere else. And she determines that she's going to advertise for a job as a governess, teaching children the skills that she has acquired. As a result of her advertisement for a new position, she receives a response inviting her to come to Thornfield to meet Mrs. Fairfax regarding becoming the governess of a young woman, who ultimately we will discover is Mr. Rochester's ward, though probably not his actual daughter. Before she leaves, however, Bessie, her old nanny, comes to see her, and we learn something else about Jane that will become important later. On page 34, Jane sees herself through the eyes of Bessie. She says, "I'm afraid you are disappointed in me, Bessie," I said this laughing. I perceived that Bessie's glance, though it expressed regard, did in no shape denote admiration. "No, Miss Jane, not exactly. You are genteel enough. You look like a lady, and it is as much as I ever expected of you. You were no beauty as a child." I smiled at Bessie's frank answer. I felt it was correct, but I confess I was not quite indifferent to its import. At 18, most people wish to please, and the conviction that they have not an exterior likely to second that desire brings anything but gratification. If you look at Jane's explanation of her response to Bessie's statement, you understand something about how Jane works, not only as a character, but as a narrator. Her language in this situation is circumspect and paraphrastic. She feels that Bessie's answer was correct, but confesses that she was not quite indifferent to its import. A confession is usually something that one does not want to reveal, and she is, using litotes, not quite indifferent to its import. In other words, she is hurt by Bessie's recognition that she is not attractive. And she goes on to say, at 18, most people wish to please, and the conviction they have not an exterior likely to second that desire brings anything but gratification. In other words, it is painful to discover that one is not attractive to others. Jane carefully downplays her response to Jessie's observation about her appearance, but clearly she is affected. So it's very important to think about why Jane wants to be able to please, because this will come up later. For a woman in the 19th century, there are three forms of power: family connections, wealth, and beauty. And Jane doesn't have any of those, and so she is forced to rely on the only form of power she has at her disposal, which is her self-control, her self-discipline. She doesn't have beauty, and she doesn't have wealth, and she doesn't have family connections, but she does have self-discipline. On page 37, this concern about her lack of beauty and the power that it would offer her comes up again. At this point, she is at Thornfield, and she is preparing for her first meeting with Mrs. Fairfax, whom she does not yet know as simply the housekeeper. She believes Mrs. Fairfax to be the owner of the home. I rose. I dressed myself with care, obliged to be plain, for I had no article of attire that was not made with extreme simplicity, and was still by nature solicitous to be neat. It was not my habit to be disregardful of appearance or careless of the impression I made. On the contrary, I ever wished to look as well as I could, and to please as much as my want of beauty would permit. I sometimes regretted that I was not handsomer. I sometimes wished to have rosy cheeks, a straight nose, and a small cherry mouth. I wished to be tall, stately, and finely developed in figure. I felt it a misfortune that I was so little, so pale, and had features so irregular and so marked. And why had I these aspirations and these regrets? It would be difficult to say. I could not then distinctly say it to myself. Yet I had a reason, and a logical, natural reason, too. However, when I had brushed my hair very smooth and put on my black frock, which, Quaker-like as it was, at least had the merit of fitting to a nicety, and adjusted my clean white tucker, I thought I should do respectably enough to appear before Mrs. Fairfax, and that my new pupil would not at least recoil from me with antipathy. Jane refers to the logical and natural reason why she wishes she had more beauty, why she wishes she had a pretty face and a tall, stately, finely developed figure. And though she won't spell it out here, it becomes quite clear later during the proposal scene when she thinks Rochester is tormenting her with his marriage to Blanche Ingram. She says, If God had given to me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. And so it's quite clear that beauty and wealth are forms of power that would give her control over men like Rochester, the kind of control that she imagines Blanche Ingram has, in fact. As soon as she discovers that Mr. Rochester is the owner of Thornfield and her employer, she determines that she is going to discover something about his personality, his identity, as she says. On page 39 at the bottom right-hand corner, she is attempting to pump Mrs. Fairfax for information about Mr. Rochester, but Mrs. Fairfax, not being interested, like Jane, in people's interior personalities, really can only tell her about his social position. This was all the account I got from Mrs. Fairfax of her employer and mine. There are people who seem to have no notion of sketching a character or observing and describing salient points, either in persons or things. The good lady evidently belonged to this class. My queries puzzled, but did not draw her out. Mr. Rochester was Mr. Rochester in her eyes, a gentleman, a landed proprietor, nothing more. She inquired and searched no further, and evidently wondered at my wish to gain a more definite notion of his identity. So Jane clearly is trying to sketch a character and gain a more definite notion of his identity. So as Jane delves into and reveals Mrs. Fairfax's personality, she also reveals her desire to learn something about Rochester's personality, to read his character. Jane wants to know who this Mr. Rochester is, not just what he is. For Jane, the other side of controlling oneself is to be able to read other people. And we'll see how often in the novel later people read other people. And they literally use that term. They read their faces, they read their expressions, they read their thoughts. Before we move on to our discussion of the relationship and the psychological contest between Rochester and Jane, we need to take one look at a very significant passage in the novel, which is a continuation of those passages we had seen earlier, in which she was longing for some freedom that is not open to her as a poor, orphaned female. She expresses her dissatisfaction with what appears to be, for her, a good life. She is employed, she is well paid as a governess of a reasonably decent little girl. She has a quiet life and is relatively safe and well cared for. And yet she's still dissatisfied because she longs for wider vistas. At the bottom of page 41, regarding her dissatisfaction, anybody may blame me who likes when I add further that, now and then, when I took a walk by myself in the grounds, when I went down to the gates and looked through them along the road, or when, while Adele played with her nurse and Mrs. Fairfax made jellies in the storeroom, I climbed the 3 staircases, raised the trapdoor of the attic, and having reached the leads, looked out afar over the sequestered field and hill and along a dim skyline, that then I longed for a power of vision which might overpass that limit, which might reach the busy world, towns, regions full of life I had heard of but never seen, that then I desired more of practical experience than I possessed, more of intercourse with my kind, of acquaintance with a variety of character than was here within my reach. I valued what was good in Mrs. Fairfax and what was good in Adele, but I believed in the existence of other and more vivid kinds of goodness, and what I believed in I wished to behold. Who blames me? Many, no doubt. I shall be called discontented. I could not help it. The restlessness was in my nature. It agitated me to pain sometimes. Then my sole relief was to walk along the corridor of the 3rd story, backwards and forwards, safe from the silence and solitude of the spot, and allow my mind's eye to dwell on whatever bright visions rose before it, and certainly they were many and glowing, to let my heart be heaved by the exultant movement which, while it swelled it in trouble, expanded it with life, and best of all, to open my inward ear to a tale that was never ended, a tale my imagination created and narrated continuously, quickened with all of incident, life, fire, feeling that I desired and had not in my actual existence. It is in vain to say human beings ought to be satisfied with tranquility. They must have action, and they will make it if they cannot find it. Millions are condemned to a stiller doom than mine, and millions are in silent revolt against their lot. Nobody knows how many rebellions besides political rebellions ferment in the masses of life which people earth. Women are supposed to be very calm generally. But women feel just as men feel. They need exercise for their faculties and a field for their efforts as much as their brothers do. They suffer from too rigid a restraint, too absolute a stagnation, precisely as men would suffer. And it is narrow-minded in their more privileged fellow creatures to say that they ought to confine themselves to making puddings and knitting stockings, to playing on the piano and embroidering bags. It is thoughtless to condemn them or laugh at them if they seek to do more or learn more than custom has pronounced necessary for their sex. And so Jane is still registering that passionate interior nature which is dissatisfied with the static tranquility of Thornfield, where there is nothing to interest her and nothing to draw out her passionate side, while on the other hand she is obligated by her condition to maintain a respectable and placid exterior. And I want to draw your attention to what happens at the end of this passage. Immediately after Jane complains about her status as a female who is supposed to confine herself to making puddings and darning stockings, we get, "When thus alone, I not infrequently heard Grace Poole's laugh, the same peal, the same low, slow ha-ha, which when first heard had thrilled me. I heard, too, her eccentric murmurs, stranger than her laugh." Jane believes this is Grace Poole because that's what she's been told, but in actuality, this is Bertha Mason. This is the crazy woman's laugh. And Bertha is clearly Jane's double in the novel. She is the alternative version of Jane, what Jane might have become had she not learned to control her passions and emotions. And at this particular point, as Jane is expressing her desire for freedom, she is echoed by the eccentric murmurs, stranger than her laugh, of Bertha Mason. Notice how often in the novel, whenever Jane does something that challenges the expectations which she is supposed to follow as a woman, it is immediately followed by a visit from Bertha in one form or another, sometimes explicitly mirroring Jane. The most obvious of which is the night before Jane's wedding, when Bertha comes down and puts on her wedding veil. So now, having established Jane's desire for a life greater than that allowed to a friendless, orphaned, penniless female, we need to examine the relationship between Jane and Rochester, the interplay between them, and their mutual attempts to uncover each other's personalities. In Rochester's case, even to the point of using what we would think of as inappropriate strategies. Later in chapter 12, on page 43, Jane meets Rochester for the first time, though she's not aware that that's who she is actually meeting. In a scene with obviously Gothic elements, Jane is walking home in the evening from the village of Hay and meets a traveler on a horse who spooks at her appearance and throws the traveler so that he is injured. The traveler, now stooping, felt his foot and leg as if trying whether they were sound. Apparently something ailed him, for he halted to the stile whence I had just risen and sat down. I was in the mood for being useful, or at least officious, I think, for now I drew near him again. "If you are hurt and want help, sir, I can fetch someone either from Thornfield Hall or Hay." "Thank you, I shall do. I have no broken bones, only a sprain." And again he stood up and tried his foot, but the result extorted an involuntary "Ugh!" Something of daylight still lingered, and the moon was waxing bright. I could see him plainly. His figure was enveloped in a riding cloak, fur-collared and steel-clasped. Its details were not apparent, but I traced the general points of middle height and considerable breadth of chest. He had a dark face with stern features and a heavy brow. His eyes and gathered eyebrows looked ireful and thwarted just now. He was past youth, but had not reached middle age. Perhaps he might be 35. I felt no fear of him, and but little shyness. Had he been a handsome, heroic-looking young gentleman, I should not have dared to stand thus questioning him against his will and offering my services unasked. I had hardly ever seen a handsome youth, never in my life spoken to one. I had a theoretical reverence and homage for beauty, elegance, gallantry, fascination. But had I met those qualities incarnate in masculine shape, I should have known instinctively that they neither had nor could have sympathy with anything in me, and should have shunned them as one would fire, lightning, or anything else that is bright, but antipathetic. If even the stranger had smiled and been good-humored to me when I addressed him, if he had put off my offer of assistance gaily and with thanks, I should have gone on my way and not felt any vocation to renew inquiries. But the frown, the roughness of the traveler set me at my ease. I retained my station when he waved me to go and announced, "I cannot think of leaving you, sir, at so late an hour in this solitary lane till I see you are fit to mount your horse." So this first encounter already starts to establish some relationship between Rochester and Jane. If he had been a handsome young man, she would have felt intimidated by him. But then she goes on to point out that even if he had been polite and friendly to her, she would have gone on her way. But the fact that he is rude and rough, that he doesn't treat her with common civility, puts her at her ease. The frown, the roughness of the traveler set me at my ease. I retained my station when he waved me to go. Rochester's setting aside common civility gives Jane the advantage in this social circumstance, because as long as she maintains her self-control in the face of his inability to control himself, she has the interpersonal advantage here. It may seem as though I'm overreading this scene. When we see this dynamic repeated over and over and over again in various encounters between Jane and Rochester, we realize that this is always a contest between the two for control of the situation, which has originated at this first moment. The unwillingness of this strange, small, plain woman to leave when told to do so is what actually draws Rochester's interest in the first place. He looked at me when I said this. He had hardly turned his eyes in my direction before. "I should think you ought to be at home yourself," said he. "If you have a home in this neighborhood, where do you come from?" "From just below, and I am not at all afraid of being out late when it is moonlight. I will run over to Hay for you with pleasure if you wish it. Indeed, I am going there to post a letter." "You live just below. Do you mean at that house with the battlements?" pointing to Thornfield Hall, on which the moon cast a hoary gleam, bringing it out distinct and pale from the woods that, by contrast with the western sky, now seemed one mass of shadow. "Yes, sir. Whose house is it?" "Mr. Rochester's." Now, of course, Jane doesn't know it, but she is actually talking to Mr. Rochester, and he knows perfectly well whose house it is. He's already started to test her character by poking her and seeing how she responds. "Do you know Mr. Rochester?" "No, I have never seen him." "He is not resident, then?" "No." "Can you tell me where he is?" He's standing right in front of her. "I cannot." "You are not a servant at the Hall, of course. You are—" He stopped, ran his eye over my dress, which as usual was quite simple. A black merino cloak, a black beaver bonnet, neither of them half fine enough for a lady's maid. He seemed puzzled to decide what I was. So Rochester is reading her dress and attempting to determine her social status from her clothing, which are not fine enough for a lady's maid, but too nice for a common servant. "I am the governess." "Ah, the governess," he repeated. "Deuce take me if I had not forgotten. The governess." And again my raiment underwent scrutiny. So already we have Jane and Rochester, even though they don't know who each other are at this point, sizing each other up. Jane tracing the general points of middle height and considerable breadth of chest, a dark face with stern features and a heavy brow. His eyes and gathered eyebrows looked ireful and thwarted just now. He was past youth, but had not reached middle age. Perhaps he might be 35. And on the other hand, we have Rochester reading Jane's clothing to try to determine who she is. Her next encounter with Rochester comes on page 45, when she is called down for an interview. And one of the things we'll discover in this passage is that she has already captured Rochester's interest, and he is going to test her to find out who this strange young woman is. When she is called down to dinner to meet with Mr. Rochester, once again, her appearance comes up, and her attempt to control her appearance by appearing plain, though well-dressed. "I repaired to my room, and with Miss Fairfax's aid replaced my black stuff dress with one of black silk, the best and only additional one I had, except one of light gray, which, in my low-wood notions of the toilette, I thought too fine to be worn except on first-rate occasions." So she has a black stuff dress, a black silk dress, and a light gray silk dress. And that is the extent of her wardrobe. So now Jane goes down to meet Mr. Rochester for the first time. Half reclined on a couch appeared Mr. Rochester, his foot supported by the cushion. He was looking at Adele and the dog. The fire shone full in his face. I knew my traveler with his broad and jetty eyebrows, his square forehead made squarer by the horizontal sweep of his black hair. I recognized his decisive nose, more remarkable for character than beauty, his full nostrils denoting, I thought, choler, his grim mouth, chin, and jaw. Yes, all three were very grim and no mistake. His shape, now divested of coke, I perceived harmonized in squareness with his physiognomy. I supposed it was a good figure in the athletic sense of the term, broad-chested and thin-flanked, though neither tall nor graceful. So once again, Jane is reading Rochester, attempting to determine his character by his appearance, his collar, which suggests anger or irritability, his grim mouth. All three were very grim and no mistake. So she's trying to read Rochester. And though she doesn't realize it, Rochester is also trying to read her, in this case by ignoring her and seeing how she responds. Mr. Rochester must have been aware of the entrance of Mrs. Fairfax and myself, but it appeared he was not in the mood to notice us, for he never lifted his head as we approached. "Here is Miss Eyre, sir," said Mrs. Fairfax in her quiet way. He bowed, still not taking his eyes from the group of the dog and the child. "Let Miss Eyre be seated," said he, and there was something in the forced, stiff bow and the impatient yet formal tone which seemed further to express, "What the deuce is it to me whether Miss Eyre be there or not? At this moment I am not disposed to accost her." Jane is reading his behavior toward her as the indication of an attitude, and his apparent attitude Jane takes as giving her the social advantage in the circumstance. I sat down quite disembarrassed. A recognition of finished politeness would probably have confused me. I could not have returned or repaid it by answering grace and elegance on my part, but harsh caprice laid me under no obligation. On the contrary, a decent quiescence under the freak of manner gave me the advantage. Besides, the eccentricity of the proceeding was piquant. I felt interested to see how he would go on. He went on as a statue would, that is, he neither spoke nor moved. So Jane feels that his harsh caprice, his impolite behavior to her, gave her the advantage in this social circumstance. This is an indication of the psychological give and take, the mutual manipulation between Jane and Rochester that we are going to see throughout their relationship. Shortly later, Adele, Rochester's ward, hints around for a present for herself, and Rochester takes this as his opportunity to read Jane, this young woman he is just formally meeting for the first time. "Who talks of cadeaux?" he said gruffly. "Do you expect a present, Miss Eyre? Are you fond of presents?" And he searched my face with eyes that I saw were dark, irate, and piercing. Rochester is going to try to read Jane through her response. And Jane is attempting, as Jane the narrator has attempted to do with us, to give a response which is non-committal. "I hardly know, sir. I have little experience of them. They are generally thought pleasant things." And Rochester recognizes her attempt to generalize the experience rather than giving a straight answer. "Generally thought? But what do you think? I should be obliged to take time, sir, before I could give you an answer worthy of your acceptance. A present has many faces to it, has it not? And one should consider all before pronouncing an opinion as to its nature." "Miss Eyre, you are not so unsophisticated as Adele. She demands a cadeau clamorously the moment she sees me. You beat about the bush." So I think at this point, Jane has been fairly successful in rebuffing his attempts to find something out about Jane other than she is a teacher. He had hoped, perhaps, that this plea for a gift would be something he could use to reveal something about Jane, but Jane is successful in deflecting that attempt. Jane and Rochester have an interesting conversation, and it would be delightful to go through it in detail if we had time. But one of the things that's interesting about it is Rochester's attempts in various ways to tease her and get some sort of information out of her. He's asking questions about her past, but also saying things that seem to be relatively strange. Even Mrs. Fairfax notices that this is a rather strange conversation. On the next page, Rochester makes it clear that he is attempting to discover something about Jane from studying her and testing her. He makes it clear that he's having a difficult time reading her, and also implies that his difficulty in reading her is what makes her fascinating, something he will repeat later. He was worried that he might find that underneath this difficult-to-read exterior is a person he would rather not know. So he's trying to figure out who she is, and he manages to figure out that she's 18. "Arithmetic, you see, is useful. Without its aid, I should hardly have been able to guess your age. It is a point difficult to fix where the features and countenance are so much at variance as in your case." So he's clearly reading her features and countenance as a means to determine something about her personality, the same way she had been reading his features and countenance earlier. Rochester's next attempt to discover something about Jane comes from his attempt to read her personality from studying her paintings. First, he acknowledges that Adele had already shown him some of her paintings, and he says, "Adele showed me some sketches this morning, which he said were yours. I don't know whether they were entirely of your doing. Probably a master aided you?" "No, indeed," I interjected. "Ah, that pricks pride." So Rochester successfully learns something about Jane from this because of her emotional response to his suggestion that she did not paint her own works. And of course, Rochester is reading through her paintings, which Jane describes to us, but which indicate something about Jane's passionate, introspective, adventurous personality, which is not revealed by her carefully curated and controlled exterior appearance. Rochester is actually fascinated by the kinds of paintings that she is able to produce because they reveal the passionate interior hidden under the staid, conservative exterior appearance. On the other hand, by his response to her paintings, Jane also comes to understand something of Rochester himself and his awareness of what she has attempted to create. At the beginning of chapter 14, on page 48, Jane describes Rochester's behavior to her, which later Rochester himself will explain was an attempt to manipulate Jane into revealing something about her personality. She says, "During this interval, even Adele was seldom sent for to his presence, and all my acquaintance with him was confined to an occasional rencontre in the hall, on the stairs, or in the gallery, when he would sometimes pass me haughtily and coldly, just acknowledging my presence by a distant nod or a cool glance, and sometimes bow and smile with gentlemanlike affability. His changes of mood did not offend me, because I saw that I had nothing to do with their alternation. The ebb and flow depended on causes quite disconnected with me." Now this begins to tell us something about Jane also. On the one hand, we learn later from Rochester himself that these are actually attempts on his part to determine something about Jane's character by how she responds to his behavior. So Jane believes that these things had nothing to do with her, but in fact they have everything to do with her because Rochester is testing her. His behavior toward her is an attempt to see how she responds to that behavior. In their next encounter, Rochester sends for Jane and Adele. Before she goes down to him, Jane determines that she has successfully maintained her very carefully controlled appearance. "Having ascertained that I was in my usual Quaker trim, where there was nothing to retouch, all being too close and plain, braided locks included, to admit of disarrangement, we descended." Mr. Rochester, as he sat in his damask-covered chair, looked different to what I had seen him look before. Not quite so stern, much less gloomy. There was a smile on his lips, and his eyes sparkled. Whether with wine or not, I am not sure, but I think it very probable. He was, in short, in his after-dinner mood, more expanded and genial, and also more self-indulgent than the frigid and rigid temper of the morning. Still, he looked preciously grim, cushioning his massive head against the swelling back of his chair, and receiving the light of the fire on his granite-hewn features, and in his great dark eyes. For he had great dark eyes, and very fine eyes, too, not without a certain change in their depth sometimes, which, if it was not softness, reminded you at least of that feeling. So this tells us a couple of things. The first thing is that Jane is getting in trouble because she is noticing his great, dark, and very fine eyes, and also that she's attempting very carefully to read their depths and understand what's going on behind those eyes. The next moment is very interesting because Jane is staring at him and studying his features, and he is aware that she is staring at him and studying his features. She is caught studying him, and being caught staring at someone in itself is revealing. Being caught staring reveals something about the person who is staring. It exposes that the person who is staring, who has made someone else the object of their gaze, is interested in that person in some way. It exposes a vulnerability. If you have ever been caught staring at someone, generally, most people will immediately look away and attempt to pretend that they weren't. He had been looking 2 minutes at the fire, and I had been looking the same length of time at him when, turning suddenly, he caught my gaze fastened on his physiognomy. "You examine me, Miss Eyre," said he. "Do you think me handsome?" I should, if I had deliberated, reply to this question by something conventionally vague and polite, but the answer somehow slipped from my tongue before I was aware. "No, sir." And this was another one of those instances where something slips from her tongue before I was aware, when her inner self speaks out without control, as opposed to the conventionally vague and polite response that she would have given had she taken time to consider. "Ah, by my word, there is something singular about you," said he. "You have the air of a little nonnette, quaint, quiet, grave, and simple, as you sit with your hands before you, and your eyes generally bent on the carpet, except, by the by, when they are directed piercingly to my face, as just now, for instance. And when one asks you a question, or makes a remark to which you are obliged to reply, you rap out a round rejoinder, which, if not blunt, is at least brusque. What do you mean by it?" "Sir, I was too plain. I beg your pardon. I ought to have replied that it is not easy to give an impromptu answer to a question about appearances, that tastes mostly differ, and that beauty is of little consequence, or something of that sort." "You ought to have replied no such thing. Beauty of little consequence, indeed." And so, under the pretense of softening the previous outrage, of stroking and soothing me into placidity, you stick a sly penknife under my ear. "Go on. What fault do you find with me, pray? I suppose I have all of my limbs and all of my features like any other man?" "Mr. Rochester, allow me to disown my first answer. I intended no pointed repartee. It was only a blunder." But Jane's blunder in this circumstance now exposes her to a more thorough examination of her character and personality by Rochester. "Just so, I think so, and you shall be answerable for it. Criticize me. Does my forehead not please you?" And so Jane has, by rapping out her round rejoinder, revealed something about herself and given him the advantage of this conversation, and now he is going to push that advantage, trying to get her to reveal something about herself by forcing her to read his personality. And remember, of course, that Charlotte Bronte believes in the science of phrenology and believes that one can read a personality through the shape of their head. And so we're going to see Rochester try to get her to read his head. In other words, he will be reading her as he watches her read him. He lifted up the sable waves of hair which lay horizontally over his brow and showed a solid enough mass of intellectual organs, but an abrupt deficiency where the suave sign of benevolence should have risen. "Now, ma'am, am I a fool?" "Far from it, sir. You would perhaps think me rude if I inquired in return whether you are a philanthropist?" There again, another stick of the penknife, when she pretended to pat my head, and that is because I said I did not like the society of children and old women. Low be it spoken. "No, young lady, I am not a general philanthropist, but I bear a conscience," and he pointed to the prominences which are said to indicate that faculty, and which, fortunately for him, were sufficiently conspicuous, giving indeed a marked breadth to the upper part of the head. "And besides, I once had a kind of rude tenderness of heart. When I was as old as you, I was a feeling fellow enough, partial to the unfledged, unfostered, and unlucky. But fortune has knocked me about since. She has even kneaded me with her knuckles. And now I flatter myself I am as hard and tough as an India-rubber ball, pervious through a chink or two still, and with one siniate point in the middle of the lump." Jane is being invited by Rochester to literally read his head and discover his personality through the shape of his head. But at the same time, he is revealing his interest to her and also revealing something about her. One of the things he is revealing, although we need more information to understand what's going on, and we don't fully understand his import until later, is that he is revealing his interest to her. When he talks about his hope of his final retransformation from India rubber back to flesh, that is a hope that he believes he may be able to achieve through Jane herself. Jane is his hope. At this point, his anticipated relationship with Jane, in whom he has a growing fascination, is his hope of being retransformed back from the bitter man disappointed in his previous relationship with Bertha Mason. Jane continues, "Decidedly he has too much wine, I thought, and I did not know what answer to make to this queer question. How could I tell whether he was capable of being retransformed? You looked very much puzzled, Miss Eyre, and though you are not pretty any more than I am handsome, yet a puzzled air becomes you. Besides, it is convenient, for it keeps those searching eyes of yours away from my physiognomy, and busies them with the worsted flowers of the rug. So puzzle on. Young lady, I am disposed to be gregarious and communicative tonight. And so Rochester is reading her face as well as inviting her to read his, and looking very carefully at her facial expressions. If we skip ahead, we are going to see Rochester again attempt to test her, and again read her facial expressions. It would please me now to draw you out, to learn more of you, therefore speak. And this, of course, is exactly what Jane is trying to avoid, being drawn out and revealing more of her beyond her carefully curated appearance. Instead of speaking, I smiled, and not a very complacent or submissive smile either. Speak, he urged. What about, sir? Whatever you like. I leave both the choice of subject and the matter of treating it entirely to yourself. Accordingly, I sat and said nothing. If he expects me to talk for the mere sake of talking and showing off, he will find he has addressed himself to the wrong person, I thought. You are dumb, Miss Eyre. Dumb doesn't mean stupid. It means silent in this case. I was dumb still. He bent his head a little towards me, and with a single hasty glance seemed to dive into my eyes. He's reading her expression. Stubborn, he said, and annoyed. Ah, it is consistent. I put my request in an absurd, almost insolent form. Now, once again, it's really important to recognize that we can't fully understand what's going on in the novel, that we are confused as Jane is confused, because we are missing one essential point of information here that unlocks the meaning of what's actually going on. And that is that Rochester is currently married to a crazy woman whom he hates. And so that even if he is fascinated by this young woman in front of him, and even if he were able to pierce through the social barrier of having a relationship with his daughter's governess, he himself is bound by his previous marriage from having a relationship with anyone at all. And this is the thoughts which are galled with dwelling on one point, cankering as a rusty nail, and that is his marriage to Bertha Mason. Rochester attempts to break through the social barrier between the employer and his employee in order to have a frank conversation. But during this time, he is still studying her appearance. I smiled. I thought to myself, Mr. Rochester is peculiar. He seems to forget that he pays me £30 per annum for receiving his orders. The smile is very well, said he, catching instantly the passing expression. But speak, too. Catching instantly the passing expression. So he's reading her thoughts directly from her expression. In the following conversation, which I'd love to go through in detail, Rochester and Jane each are trying to learn something about one another, but because Jane lacks an essential piece of information about Rochester, that is that he is already married to Bertha Mason and he hates the fact, and he doesn't like Thornfield because Bertha Mason resides here, and he rarely comes here because Bertha Mason resides here, Jane is incapable of fully understanding what's going on in this conversation. Nevertheless, during this conversation, Rochester is becoming more and more interested in Jane and beginning to plot what ultimately will become Jane's potential undoing in the novel, which is that he is going to attempt to capture and seduce this young woman. He says, I scarcely think the notion that flitted across my brain was an error. I believed it was an inspiration rather than a temptation. It was very genial, very soothing, I know that. Here it comes again. It is no devil, I assure you, or if it be, it is put on the robes of an angel of light. I think I must admit so fair a guest when it asks interest to my heart. And he's actually talking about interest in Jane. But Jane, not knowing the context, doesn't understand it. To speak truth, sir, I don't understand you at all. I cannot keep up the conversation because it has got out of my depth. Let's skip ahead. And this is Rochester reading her personality, but also plotting her fate. He says, if you did, it would be in such a grave, quiet manner I should mistake it for sense. Do you ever laugh, Miss Eyre? Don't trouble yourself to answer. I see you laugh rarely, but you can laugh very merrily. Believe me, you are not naturally austere any more than I am naturally vicious. The Lowood constraint still clings to you somewhat, controlling your features, muffling your voice, and restricting your limbs, and you fear in the presence of a man and brother, or father or master, or what you will, to smile too gaily, to speak too freely, or move too quickly. But in time, I think you will learn to be natural with me, as I find it impossible to be conventional with you, and then your looks and movements will have more vivacity and variety than they dare offer now. I see at intervals the glance of a curious sort of bird through the close-set bars of a cage. A vivid, restless, resolute captive is there. Were it but free, it would soar cloud high. And so Rochester has already begun his plot to set free this curious sort of bird hiding behind the close-set bars of a cage, to free Jane's inner self and personality. Now, as we will see later in the novel, this is an essential threat to Jane's integrity, to her personality, because for Jane, the balance between her passionate interior and her carefully controlled exterior is what makes her whole, what maintains her integrity. And by violating her self-control and self-discipline, Rochester threatens the integrity of Jane's character. Later, Jane will explain that this violation of her self-control threatens to turn her into either Bertha Mason or Celine Varens, his discarded mistress, whom we will meet in the next chapter as Rochester, inappropriately, especially by Victorian standards, explains to his 18-year-old employee his past sexual history. Looking back at this chapter retrospectively through what we learn later, it's clear that this is the point at which Rochester determines that he will free the caged bird from its closely set bars by inspiring her jealousy in the person of Blanche Ingram, whom he will pretend to court later in the novel as a way of creating jealousy within Jane, which he hopes will cause her to reveal her feelings for him. In the midst of his explanation of his relationship with Celine Varens, the mother of Adele and one of his previous mistresses, he seems to recognize that one of the elements that will allow him to pierce through Jane's reserve is by evoking her jealousy. You never felt jealousy, did you, Miss Eyre? Of course not. I need not ask you, because you never felt love. You have both sentiments yet to experience. Your soul sleeps. The shock is yet to be given which shall awaken it. You think all existence lapses in as quiet a flow as that in which your youth has hitherto slid away. Floating on with closed eyes and muffled ears, you neither see the rocks bristling not far off in the bed of the flood, nor hear the breakers boil at their base. But I tell you, and you may mark my words, you will come some day to a craggy pass in the channel, where the whole of life's stream will be broken up into a whirl and tumult, foam and noise. Either you will be dashed to atoms on crag points, or lifted up and borne on by some master wave into calmer current, as I am now. I like this day. I like that sky of steel. I like the sternness and stillness of the world under this frost. I like Thornfield, its antiquity, its retirement, its old crow trees and thorn trees, its gray facade, and lines of dark windows reflecting that metal welkin. And yet how long have I abhorred the very thought of it, shunned it like a great plague house? How do I still abhor? He ground his teeth and was silent. He arrested his step and struck his boot against the hard ground. Some hated thought seemed to have him in his grip, and to hold him so tightly that he could not advance. We were ascending the avenue when he thus paused. The hall was before us. Lifting his eye to its battlements, he cast over them a glare such as I never saw before or since. Pain, shame, ire, impatience, disgust, detestation seemed momentarily to hold a quivering conflict in the large pupil dilating under his ebon eyebrow. Wild was the wrestle which should be paramount, but another feeling rose in triumph, something hard and cynical, self-willed and resolute. It settled his passion and petrified his countenance. He went on. During the moment I was silent, Miss Eyre, I was arranging a point with my destiny. This passage is a tremendously telling one once we know what's actually going on here. In the first place, he recognizes that part of Jane's ability to maintain her reserve is the fact that she has never been in love and felt jealousy. And in order to break through his reserve, he is going to have to inspire in her both love and jealousy, which he will do later by bringing Blanche Ingram there as his purported fiancée, though he has no intention of courting her, in fact, because he can't marry her. And the second thing that goes on here is that he wrestles with himself about his past, and The hatred that he feels for Bertha Mason, the woman to whom he is actually married, and who resides in the battlements at the top of the house at which he is glaring. And also that he has arranging a point with his destiny. And the point with his destiny is how he is going to behave toward Jane. And apparently his resolution at this point, "I will like it," said I dare it. And he subjoined moodily, "I will keep my word. I will break obstacles to happiness, to goodness. Yes, goodness." The point he is resolved with his destiny is to establish a relationship with Jane. And Rochester is already being more successful than he knows. At the bottom of page 55, Jane admits that her feelings toward Rochester have changed. "The ease of his manner freed me from painful restraint. The friendly frankness, as correct as cordial, with which he treated me, drew me to him. I felt at times as if he were my relation rather than my master. Yet he was imperious sometimes still, but I did not mind that. I saw it was his way. So happy, so gratified did I become with this new interest added to life, that I ceased to pine after my kindred. My thin, crescent destiny seemed to enlarge. The blanks of existence were filled up. My bodily health improved. I gathered flesh and strength." And was Mr. Rochester now ugly in my eyes? No, reader. Gratitude and many associations, all pleasurable and genial, made his face the object I best liked to see. His presence in a room was more cheering than the brightest fire. On page 57, at the end of chapter 35, and the end of volume 2 in the 3-volume version of the novel, the event occurs which reveals to Jane that Rochester has some interest in her as well. Bertha, who is occasionally able to escape from her quarters because Grace Poole tends to indulge too often in a drop of the old spirits, sets fire to Rochester's bed. She tends to like setting fires. And had Jane not heard something and come to his rescue, Rochester would have burned to death in a rather horrible way because, of course, he would have been surrounded by bed curtains and heavy bedding that would have trapped him, and he would have died in his sleep. At the end of this moment, we have this passage where Rochester almost expresses his feelings for Jane, and Jane understands what he meant. And by the way, the passage is sort of funny because while Rochester is professing in veiled phrases his feelings, Jane is maintaining her reserve. At the bottom of page 57, "Good night then, sir," said I, departing. He seemed surprised. Very inconsistently so, as he had just told me to go. "What?" he exclaimed. "Are you quitting me already, and in that way?" "You said I might go, sir, but not without taking leave, not without a word or two of acknowledgment and goodwill, not, in short, in that brief, dry fashion. Why, you have saved my life, snatched me from a horrible and excruciating death, and you walk past me as if we were mutual strangers. At least shake hands." He held out his hand. I gave him mine. He took it first in one, then in both of his own. "You have saved my life. I have a pleasure in owing you so immense a debt. I cannot say more. Nothing else that has being would have been tolerable to me in the character of a creditor for such an obligation. But you, it is different. I feel your benefits no burden, Jane." He paused, gazed at me. Words almost visible trembled on his lips, but his voice was checked. "Good night again, sir. There is no debt, benefit, burden, obligation in the case." And Jane's attitude here, in contrast with Rochester's, is hilarious. "I knew," he continued, "you would do me good in some way at some time. I saw it in your eyes when I first beheld you. Their expression and smile did not—" Again he stopped. "Did not," he proceeded hastily, "strike delight to my very inmost heart so for nothing. People talk of natural sympathies. I have heard of good genii. There are grains of truth even in the wildest fable. My cherished preserver, good night." Strange energy was in his voice, strange fire in his look. "I am glad I happened to be awake," I said, and then I was going. "What? Will you go?" "I am cold, sir." "Cold, yes, and standing in a pool. Go then, Jane, go." But still he retained my hand, and I could not free it. I bethought myself of an expedient. "I think I hear Mrs. Fairfax move, sir," said I. "Well, leave me." He relaxed his fingers, and I was gone. I regained my couch, but never thought of sleep. Till morning dawned, I was tossed on a buoyant but unquiet sea where billows of trouble rolled under surges of joy. I thought sometimes I saw beyond its wild waters a shore, sweet as the hills of Beulah, and now and then a freshening gale, wakened by hope, bore my spirit triumphantly towards the bourne. But I could not reach it, even in fancy. A counteracting breeze blew off land and continually drove me back. Sense would resist delirium. Judgment would warn passion. Too feverish to rest, I rose as soon as day dawned. So Jane understands what's going on beneath Rochester's almost visible but never fully expressed words. But at the same time, Jane recognizes the complication of such a relationship. She also expresses her awareness of this relationship in very carefully veiled metaphorical terms, almost as unwilling to admit, "I think he loves me." Instead, what she says is, "A buoyant but unquiet sea where billows of trouble rolled under surges of joy, and beyond its wild waters a shore sweet as the hills of Beulah." But on the other hand, she recognizes that such a relationship is impossible. And this will be very important later in the novel, and we will see this come up at two very essential moments. The conflict between her self-control and her desire. A counteracting breeze blew off land and continually drove me back. Sense would resist delirium. Judgment would warn passion. So it's the conflict between sense and judgment on the one hand, and delirium and passion on the other. The two sides of Jane's character in conflict. And ultimately, Rochester's goal in the following section is going to be to get rid of the sense and judgment that controls her delirious passion. The method he is going to use to achieve his goal is by inspiring in Jane jealousy that will cause her to recognize and express her love for him. The next morning, after their almost romantic encounter, Jane gets up looking forward to seeing Mr. Rochester, but doesn't see him all day, and then finally discovers from Mrs. Fairfax that Rochester has gone away. Now, we know this is not coincidental that he's gone away the next day, but Jane has no idea. And where he has gone is to visit a place where there are several beautiful young women. On page 60, are there ladies at the Lees? There are Mrs. Eshton and her 3 daughters, very elegant young ladies indeed. And there are the Honorable Blanche and Mary Ingram, most beautiful of women, I suppose. Indeed, I have seen Blanche 6 or 7 years since, when she was a girl of 18. And then Mrs. Fairfax makes it worse. And what was she like? Tall, fine bust, sloping shoulders, long, graceful neck, olive complexion, dark and clear, noble features, eyes rather like Mr. Rochester's, large and black and brilliant as her jewels. And then she had such a fine head of hair, raven black, and so becomingly arranged, a crown of thick plaits behind, and in front the longest, glossiest curls I ever saw. She was dressed in pure white. An amber-colored scarf was passed over her shoulder and across her breast, tied at the side, and descending in long, fringed ends below her knee. She wore an amber-colored flower, too, in her hair. It contrasted well with the jetty mass of her curls. She was greatly admired, of course. Yes, indeed, and not only for her beauty, but for her accomplishments. She was one of the ladies who sang. A gentleman accompanied her on the piano. She and Mr. Rochester sang a duet. So Jane is being introduced by Mrs. Fairfax to her supposed rival, Blanche Ingram. And this beautiful and accomplished lady, she is not yet married? It appears not. Jane, of course, draws the obvious and intended conclusion that Rochester has gone to court Blanche Ingram. And the result of her conclusion is that she resolves to intensify her self-control by externalizing her self-image versus her supposed image of Blanche. When once more alone, I reviewed the information I had got, looked into my heart, examined its thoughts and feelings, and endeavored to bring with a strict hand such as been straying through imagination's boundless and trackless waste into this safe fold of common sense. Arraigned at my own bar, memory having given her evidence of the hopes, wishes, sentiments I had been cherishing since last night, of the general state of mind in which I had indulged for nearly a fortnight past, reason having come forward and told in her own quiet way a plain, unvarnished tale showing how I had rejected the real and rapidly devoured the ideal, I pronounced judgment to this effect: that a greater fool than Jane Eyre had never breathed a breath of life, that a more fantastic idiot had never surfeited herself on sweet lies and swallowed poison as if it were nectar. You, I said, a favorite with Mr. Rochester? You, gifted with the power of pleasing him? You of importance to him in any way? Go, your folly sickens me. And you have derived pleasure from occasional tokens of preference, equivocal tokens shown by a gentleman of family and a man of the world to a dependent and a novice? How dared you, poor stupid dupe? Could not even self-interest make you wiser? You repeated to yourself this morning the brief scene of last night? Cover your face and be ashamed. He said something in praise of your eyes, did he? Blind puppy, open their bleared lids and look upon your own accursed senselessness. It does good to no woman to be flattered by your superior, who cannot possibly intend to marry her, and it is madness in all women to let a secret love kindle within them, which, if unreturned and unknown, must devour the life that feeds it, and, if discovered and responded to, must lead, igneous fatuous-like, into miry wilds whence there is no extrication. Never ignore the word madness in this novel, and when Jane says it is madness in all women to let a secret love kindle within them, that clearly aligns Jane's madness with her interior life and her passion for Rochester, which is the element that is leading her toward destruction if it is not curbed, which is something she will work to control by reestablishing her self-discipline in the next passage. Listen then, Jane Eyre, to your sentence. Tomorrow, place the glass before you, and draw in chalk your own picture faithfully without softening one defect. Omit no harsh lines, smooth away no displeasing irregularity. Write under it, portrait of a governess, disconnected, poor, and plain. Afterwards, take a piece of smooth ivory. You have one prepared in your drawing box. Take your palette, mix your freshest, finest, clearest tints. Choose your most delicate camel hair pencils. Delineate carefully the loveliest face you can imagine. Paint it in your softest shades and sweetest hues, according to the description given by Miss Fairfax of Blanche Ingram. Remember the raven ringlets, the oriental eye. What? You revert to Mr. Rochester as a model? Order. No snivel, no sentiment, no regret. I will endure only sense and resolution. Recall the august yet harmonious lineaments, the Grecian neck and bust. Let the round and dazzling arm be visible in the delicate hand. Omit neither diamond ring nor gold bracelet. Portray faithful the attire, aerial lace and glistening satin, graceful scarf and golden rose. Call it Blanche, an accomplished lady of rank. Whenever in future you should chance to fancy Mr. Rochester thinks well of you, take out these two pictures and compare them. Say, Mr. Rochester might probably win that noble lady's love if he chose to strive for it. Is it likely he would waste a serious thought on this indigent and insignificant plebeian? I'll do it. And having framed this determination, I grew calm and fell asleep. I kept my word. An hour or two sufficed to sketch my own portrait in crayons, and in less than a fortnight I had completed an ivory miniature of an imaginary Blanche Ingram. It had looked a lovely face enough, and when compared with a real head in chalk, the contrast was as great as self-control could desire. I derived benefit from the task. It had kept my head and hands employed and given force and fixedness to the new impressions I wished to stamp indelibly on my heart. Ere long I had reason to congratulate myself on the course of wholesome discipline to which I had thus forced my feelings to submit. Thanks to it, I was able to meet subsequent occurrences with a decent calm which, had they found me unprepared, I should probably have been unequal to maintain, even externally. And so Rochester's plot of making Jane believe he's gone off to court beautiful and accomplished Blanche Ingram has this effect on Jane. She seeks to reestablish her self-discipline and self-control, and she does it by creating this externalized view of herself as she must appear to someone outside of her, and then to create an idealized view of Blanche, and then to hold these together to reestablish her sense of what she must appear like to someone outside. And as a result of this effort, the contrast was as great as self-control could desire. The goal is to establish self-control, and the contrast between her externalized view of herself and her imagined view of Blanche helps reinforce her self-control, to establish a course of wholesome discipline to which I thus forced my feelings to submit. So she submits her internal passions to a course of self-discipline established by an externalized view of how she must appear to Rochester as opposed to how she imagines Blanche appears to Rochester. Of course, Jane's response to the coming of Blanche Ingram is not entirely passive. She doesn't just roll over and submit to Rochester's apparent desire to marry Blanche. In fact, she engages in her own course of surveillance in order to come to understand who this Blanche is. Notice how often during this section we get images of Jane hiding in the shadows, watching. We get passages like this on page 63. I followed, taking care to stand on one side so that screened by the curtain I could see without being seen. So look at how often Jane sees without being seen. In the opposing column, so I stood still at this end, which being windowless was dark, quite dark now, for the sun was set and the twilight gathering. Once again, curtained so she could not be seen by those she observes. She not only subjects Blanche and the other guests to observation, but she also studies Rochester because she's interested in seeing the relationship between Rochester and Blanche. On page 66, Rochester finally reappears, the first time she's seen him since their dramatic incident after the fire. No sooner did I see that his attention was riveted on them and that I might gaze without being observed than my eyes were drawn involuntarily to his face. I could not keep their lids under control. They would rise, and the irids would fix on him. Interestingly enough, there's two different elements coming in here. Of course, we have I might gaze without being observed, but also Jane's interior passions are controlling her eyes, that she could not keep her eyes under control, and they would fix on Rochester. And of course, Rochester knows that this is exactly what she's doing because this is his goal. His goal is to put on a show in order to make Jane jealous. In fact, he is watching her watch him. And at the bottom of the page, we finally get Jane's admission that she does, in fact, love Rochester. Even though she had not intended to love him, he made me love him without looking at me, which is precisely what he was intending to do. This whole show is to make Jane admit openly that she loves him, first to herself and then to him. On the bottom of page 68, Rochester and Jane finally have a conversation, and Rochester seems to be enjoying the fact that he has successfully tortured her. Return to the drawing room. You are deserting too early. I am tired, sir. He looked at me for a minute. And a little depressed, he said. What about? Tell me. Nothing, sir. I am not depressed. But I affirm that you are, so much depressed that a few more words would bring tears to your eyes. Indeed, they are there now, shining and swimming, and a bead has slipped from the lash and fallen onto the flag. If I had time and was not in mortal dread of some prating prig of a serpent passing, I would know what all this means. Well, tonight I excuse you. But understand that so long as my visitors stay, I expect you to appear in the drawing room every evening. It is my wish. Don't neglect it. Now go and send Sophy for Adele. Good night, my... He stopped, bit his lip, and abruptly left me. He almost said, good night, my love, of course. So this is his intent, to keep her in the drawing room every night so that he can torture her. The next night, they play charades. In charades, you enact a word in parts, and the other participants have to guess what the word is. And the word that Rochester and Blanche choose to enact is Bridewell. And of course, in order to enact bride, they enact a marriage, with Rochester enacting marrying Blanche. This entirely for the purpose of torturing Jane. Now, Jane does admit to jealousy, but she doesn't admit to jealousy simply because Rochester seems to be courting someone who is not her. Her jealousy comes from the fact that he is courting someone who is not equal to Jane and the quality of her interior life and the compatibility of her interior life with Rochester's. On page 70, Jane says, there was nothing to cool or banish love in these circumstances, though much to create despair. Much, too, you will think, reader, to engender jealousy, if a woman in my position could presume to be jealous of a woman in Miss Ingram's. But I was not jealous, or very rarely. The nature of the pain I suffered could not be explained by that word. Miss Ingram was a mark beneath jealousy. She was too inferior to excite the feeling. Pardon the seeming paradox, I mean what I say. She was very showy, but she was not genuine. She had a fine person, many brilliant attainments, but her mind was poor, her heart barren by nature. Nothing bloomed spontaneously on that soil. No unforced natural fruit delighted by its freshness. So in other words, unlike Jane, Blanche is all show and has no passionate interior. There is nothing inside. Jane is a balance between a controlled exterior and a passionate interior. Blanche is all show, no substance. She was not good. She was not original. She used to repeat sounding phrases from books. She never offered nor had an opinion of her own. She advocated a high tone of sentiment, but she did not know the sensations of sympathy and pity. Tenderness and truth were not in her. Too often she betrayed this by the undue vent she gave to a spiteful antipathy she had conceived against little Adele, pushing her away with some contumelious epithet if she happened to approach her, sometimes ordering her from the room, and always treating her with coldness and acrimony. Other eyes besides mine watched these manifestations of character, watched them closely, keenly, shrewdly. Yes, the future bridegroom, Mr. Rochester himself, exercised over his intended a ceaseless surveillance. And it was from this sagacity, this guardedness of his, this perfect clear consciousness of his fair one's defects, this obvious absence of passion in his sentiments toward her, that my ever-torturing pain arose. So Rochester is exercising a ceaseless surveillance. What Jane doesn't know is that Rochester is also exercising a ceaseless surveillance over Jane at this point. I saw he was going to marry her for family, perhaps political reasons, because her rank and connections suited him. I felt he had not given her his love, and that her qualifications were ill-adapted to win from him that treasure. This was the point. This was where the nerve was touched and teased. This is where the fever was sustained and fed. She could not charm him. If she had managed the victory at once, and he had yielded and sincerely laid his heart at her feet, I should have covered my face, turned to the wall, and figuratively have died to them. If Miss Ingram had been a good and noble woman, endowed with force, fervor, kindness, sense, I should have had one vital struggle with two tigers, jealousy and despair. Then, my heart torn out and devoured, I should have admired her, acknowledged her excellence, and been quiet for the rest of my days. And the more absolute her superiority, the deeper would have been my admiration, the more truly tranquil my quiescence. But as matters really stood, to watch Miss Ingram's efforts at fascinating Mr. Rochester, to witness their repeated failure, herself unconscious that they did fail, vainly fancying that each shaft launch hit the mark, and infatuatedly pluming herself on success, when her pride and self-complacency repelled further and further what she wished to allure. To witness this was to be at once under ceaseless excitation and ruthless restraint. Because when she failed, I saw how she might have succeeded. Arrows that continually glanced off from Mr. Rochester's breast and fell harmless at his feet might, I knew, if shot by a surer hand, have quivered keen in his proud heart, have called love into a stern eye and softness into a sardonic face. Or better still, without weapons, a silent conquest might have been won. And so Jane's jealousy is that she has the tools to win from Rochester what Blanche does not. Blanche imagines herself to be delightful and attractive and engaging, but in fact her behavior and attitudes are repelling Rochester, and Jane knows that had she the tools that Blanche has, she, Jane, would be successful. At the same time that Blanche is unable to accurately read Rochester, Jane is able to accurately read Blanche, which is one of the reasons that Jane is so much more successful here, because not only is she good at controlling her exterior, but she's also successful at reading through other people's characters. Rochester's final scheme to get Jane to admit how she feels is to pretend to leave Thornfield and to come back disguised as a gypsy woman fortune teller. The gypsy fortune teller shows up at Thornfield, demands to tell the fortunes of the ladies in the house. Blanche is one of the first to go in, and after Blanche's fortune, she comes out and sits down, and Jane watches her closely. I watched her for nearly a half an hour. During all that time, she never turned a page, and her face grew momently darker. more dissatisfied, and more sourly expressive of disappointment. She had obviously not heard anything to her advantage, and it seemed to me, from her prolonged fit of gloom and taciturnity, that she herself, notwithstanding her professed indifference, attached undue importance to whatever revelations had been made to her. And what we will find out later from Rochester is that he told Blanche that Rochester's fortune was actually quite small, and that Rochester himself was not an advantageous match. It's not true, of course, but he is testing Blanche as much as he is testing Jane. So finally, Jane is invited to go in and talk to this fortune teller. And this is an interesting scene because it brings out exactly how this reading of faces takes place. The fortune teller, Rochester in disguise, asks Jane about Rochester's relationship with Blanche. And he asks the questions in language that is designed to provoke Jane. "Eagerness of a listener," repeated she. "Yes, Mr. Rochester has sat by the hour, his ear inclined to the fascinating lips that took such delight in their task of communicating. And Mr. Rochester so willing to receive and look so grateful for the pastime given him. You have noticed this?" This is the gypsy describing what the gypsy couldn't possibly know about the behavior of Blanche and Rochester. "Grateful? I cannot remember detecting gratitude in his face." "Detecting? You have analyzed then. And what did you detect if not gratitude?" And so Jane is telling Rochester without knowing that she has been paying careful attention and has analyzed Rochester's behavior. I said nothing. "You have seen love, have you not? And looking forward, you have seen him married and beheld his bride happy?" "Not exactly. Your witch's skill is rather at fault sometimes." "What the devil have you seen then?" "Never mind. I came here to inquire, not to confess." "Is it known that Mr. Rochester is to be married?" "Yes, and to the beautiful Miss Ingram." Jane says she wants the gypsy fortune teller to read her fortune. And the fortune teller, Rochester, tells her things about herself. "Your fortune is yet doubtful. When I examined your face, one trait contradicted another." Once again, we have reading faces. "Chance has meted you a measure of happiness, that I know. I knew it before I came here this evening. She has laid it carefully on one side for you. I saw her do it. It depends on yourself to stretch out your hand, to take it up. But whether you will do so is the problem I study." Kneel again on the rug. I knelt. She did not stoop towards me, but only gazed, leaning back in her chair. She began muttering. And here Rochester is literally reading Jane's face, and reading it in real time as he's expressing aloud what he sees in Jane's face, and also reading how she reacts to what he says. "The flame flickers in the eye. The eye shines like dew. It looks soft and full of feeling. It smiles at my jargon. It is susceptible. Impression follows impression through its clear sphere. Where it ceases to smile, it is sad. An unconscious lassitude weighs on the lid. That signifies melancholy resulting from loneliness. It turns from me. It will not suffer further scrutiny. It seems to deny by a mocking glance the truth of the discoveries I have already made, to disown the charge of both sensibility and chagrin. Its pride and reserve only confirm me in my opinion. The eye is favorable." So Jane is responding to what Rochester is saying as he, disguised as the fortune teller, reads her face, and he is reading her response as well. "As to the mouth, it delights at times in laughter. It is disposed to impart all that the brain conceives, though I dare say it would be silent on much the heart experiences. Mobile and flexible, it was never intended to be compressed in the eternal silence of solitude. It is a mouth which should speak much and smile often, and have human affection for its interlocutor. That feature, too, is propitious. I see no enemy to fortunate issue, but in the brow. And that brow professes to say, I can live alone if self-respect and circumstances require me to do so. I need not sell my soul to buy bliss. I have an inward treasure born with me which can keep me alive if all extraneous delight should be withheld or offered only at a price I cannot afford to give. The forehead declares, reason sits firm and holds the reins, and she will not let the feelings burst away and hurry her to wild chasms. The passions may rage furiously like true heathens as they are, and the desires may imagine all sorts of vain things, but the judgment shall still have the last word in every argument, and the casting vote in every decision. Strong wind, earthquake, shock, and fire may pass by, but I shall follow the guiding of that still small voice which interprets the dictates of conscience. So Rochester actually here foretells the disaster that is coming for them, because He talks on the one hand about the visual implications in Jane's face about her passionate interior, her eye and her mouth, both of which show her capability of expressing and feeling emotion. But on the other side, he talks about her self-discipline and self-control. Reason sits firm and holds the reins, and she will not let the feelings burst away and hurry her to wild chasms. The passions may rage furiously, but judgment shall still have the last word in every argument and the casting vote in every decision. And this actually turns out to be the case. So we have passion on the one hand versus judgment and reason on the other. And Rochester recognizes that Jane will never surrender her judgment to her passion. And this ends up being the problem that he faces. So in this scene, we get analysis of faces, reading of characters, but also, in some sense, an understanding of the barriers that Rochester faces as he attempts to use these various stratagems to break through Jane's self-discipline and to get Jane to admit her love for him. In chapter 23, we get the conclusion of Rochester's nefarious plot to overcome Jane's self-control. And this is in the proposal scene. And Rochester lays it on pretty thick. "Jane," he recommenced as we entered the laurel walk and slowly strayed in the direction of the sunk fence and the horse chestnut. "Thornfield is a pleasant place in summer, is it not?" "Yes, sir." "You must have become in some degree attached to the house, you who have an eye for natural beauties and a good deal of the organ of adhesiveness." "I am attached to it indeed." "And though I don't comprehend how it is, I perceive you have acquired a degree of regard for that foolish little child Adele, too, and even for simple Dame Fairfax." "Yes, sir, in different ways I have affection for both." "And would be sorry to part with them?" "Yes." "Pity," he said, and sighed and paused. "It is always the way of events in this life," he continued presently. "No sooner have you got settled in a pleasant resting place than a voice calls out to you to rise and move on, for the hour of repose is expired." "Must I move on, sir?" I asked. "Must I leave Thornfield?" "I believe you must, Jane. I am sorry, Janet, but I believe indeed you must." This was a blow, but I did not let it prostrate me. "Well, sir, I shall be ready when the order to march comes." "It is come now. I must give it tonight." "Then you are going to be married, sir?" "Exactly. Precisely. With your usual acuteness, you have hit the nail straight on the head. Soon, sir?" "Very soon, that is, Miss Eyre. And you'll remember, Jane, the first time I, or rather rumor, plainly intimated to you that it was my intention to put my old bachelor's neck into the sacred noose, to enter into the holy estate of matrimony, to take Miss Ingram to my bosom. In short, she's an extensive armful, but that's not to the point. One can't have too much of such a very excellent thing as my beautiful Blanche. You're not turning your head to look after more moths, are you?" Of course, Rochester has absolutely no intention of marrying Blanche. Blanche has gone away thinking Rochester has no money and is not interested in marrying him anymore. And Rochester is making fun of the fact that Jane has jumped to the conclusion he has carefully prepared for her, and also pretends to ignore the fact that Jane is stricken by his admission. "I wish to remind you that it was you who first said to me, with that discretion I respect in you, with that foresight, prudence, and humility which befit your responsible, independent position, that in case I married Miss Ingram, both you and little Adele had better trot forthwith. I pass over the sort of slur conveyed in this suggestion on the character of my beloved. Indeed, when you are far away, Janet, I shall try to forget it. I shall notice only its wisdom, which is such that I have made it my law of action. Adele must go to school, and you, Miss Eyre, must get a new situation." "Yes, sir, I will advertise immediately. And meantime, I suppose I may stay here till I find another shelter to betake myself to," but I stopped, feeling it would not do to risk a long sentence, for my voice was not quite under command. "In about a month I hope to be a bridegroom," continued Mr. Rochester, "and in the interim I shall myself look out for employment in an asylum for you." "Thank you, sir. I am sorry to give." "Oh, no need to apologize. I consider that when a dependent does her duty as well as you have done yours, she has a sort of claim upon her employer for any little assistance he can conveniently render her. Indeed, I have already, through my future mother-in-law, heard of a place that I think will suit. It is to undertake the education of 5 daughters of Mrs. Dionysius O'Gall of Bitternut Lodge, Connaught, Ireland. You'll like Ireland, I think. They're such warm-hearted people there, they say. It's a long way off, sir. No matter. A girl of your sense will not object to the voyage or the distance. And Rochester is really laying it on thick here, keeping in mind the prejudice of the English against the Irish, and the fact that the recommendation for this place came from Blanche's mother. He is recommending that she will take a job with Mrs. Dionysus O'Gall. Gall is the bitter humor of Bitternut Lodge, Connaught, Ireland. He is trying to make it sound as unappealing and as unpleasant as he can. So he's getting close to getting Jane to break down. Not the voyage, but the distance. And then the sea is a barrier. From what, Jane? From England and from Thornfield and, well, from you, sir. I said this almost involuntarily, and with as little sanction of free will, my tears gushed out. Jane's passionate side is erupting again. I did not cry so as to be heard, however. I avoided sobbing. The thought of Mrs. O'Gall and Bitternut Lodge struck cold to my heart, and colder the thought of all the brine and foam, destined as it seemed to rush between me and the master at whose side I now walked, and coldest the remembrance of the wider ocean, wealth, caste, custom intervened between me and what I naturally and inevitably loved. It is a long way, I said again. It is, to be sure, and when you get to Bitternut Lodge, Connaught, Ireland, he repeats the full address. He's really being quite cruel. I shall never see you again, Jane. That's morally certain. I never go over to Ireland, not having myself much of a fancy for the country. We have been good friends, Jane, have we not? Yes, sir. And when friends are on the eve of separation, they like to spend the little time that remains to them close to each other. Come, we'll talk over the voyage and the parting quietly half an hour or so, while the stars enter into their shining life up in heaven yonder. Here is the chestnut tree. Here is the bench at its old roots. Come, we will sit there in peace tonight. Though we should never more be destined to sit there together, he seated me and himself. It's a long way to Ireland, Janet. I am sorry to send my little friend on such weary travels, but if I can't do better, how is it to be helped? Are you anything akin to me, do you think, Jane? I could risk no sort of answer by this time. My heart was still. Because, he said, I sometimes have a queer feeling with regard to you, especially when you are near me as now. It is as if I had a string somewhere under my left ribs. One's heart is, of course, under one's left ribs, tightly and inextricably knotted to a similar string situated in the corresponding quarter of your little frame. And if that boisterous channel and 200 miles or so of land come broad between us, I am afraid that cord of communion will be snapped. And then I have a nervous notion I should take to bleeding inwardly. As for you, you'd forget me. That I never should, sir, you know. Impossible to proceed. Jane, do you hear that nightingale singing in the wood? Listen. And listening, I sobbed convulsively, for I could not repress what I endured no longer. I was obliged to yield. I was shaken from head to foot with acute distress. When I did speak, it was only to express an impetuous wish that I had never been born or never come to Thornfield. So Jane erupts. Rochester is winning. Because you were sorry to leave it? He's trying to get her to admit it. The vehemence of emotion, stirred by grief and love within me, was claiming mastery and struggling for full sway, and asserting a right to predominate, to overcome, to live, to rise and reign at last. Yes, and to speak. And so this is Jane's passionate interior, finally, after all these years under strict control, finally breaking loose. So she is going to finally speak how she truly feels. I grieve to leave Thornfield. I love Thornfield. I love it because I have lived in it a full and delightful life, momentarily at least. I have not been trampled on. I have not been petrified. I have not been buried with inferior minds and excluded from every glimpse of communion with what is bright and energetic and high. I have talked face to face with what I reverence, with what I delight in, with an original, a vigorous and expanded mind. I have known you, Mr. Rochester, and it strikes me with terror and anguish to feel I absolutely must be torn from you forever. I see the necessity of departure, and it is like looking on the necessity of death. Where do you see necessity, he asks suddenly, and now that Rochester has got what he wants, he is going to spring the final stage of his trap, which is to propose to her. I say trap because, of course, he can't legally marry her. Where? You, sir, have placed it before me.
In what shape? In the shape of Miss Ingrid, a noble and beautiful woman, your bride. My bride? What bride? I have no bride. But you will have. Yes, I will. I will. He set his teeth, and of course he means Jane. Then I must go. You have said it yourself. No, you must stay. I swear it, and the oath shall be kept. I tell you I must go, I retorted, roused to something like passion. And one wonders what actual passion would look like if this is only something like it. Do you think I am an automaton, a machine without feelings, and can bear to have my morsel of bread snatched from my lips and my drop of living water dashed from my cup? Do you think because I am poor, obscure, plain, and little, I am soulless and heartless? You think wrong. I have as much soul as you, and as full as much heart. And if God had gifted me with some beauty and much wealth, I should have made it as hard for you to leave me as it is now for me to leave you. I am not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, nor even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit, just as if we had both passed through the grave when we stood at God's feet, equal as we are. As we are, repeated Rochester. So, he added, enclosing me in his arms and gathering me to his breast, pressing his lips on my lips. So, Jane. Yes, so, sir, I rejoined. And yet not so, for you are a married man, or as good as a married man, and wed to one inferior to you, to one with whom you have no sympathy, whom I do not believe you truly love, for I have seen and heard you sneer at her. I would scorn such a union. Therefore I am better than you. Let me go. Well, Jane is exactly right. He is, in fact, a married man. He is, in fact, wed to one who is inferior to him, and with one he has no sympathy, whom he does not truly love. Only it's not Blanche, it's Bertha. And that is the problem with this situation.
That is why this is not a romantic proposal.
Rochester is finally persuading Jane to profess her love, and on the next page will persuade her to consent to marry him, even though he is in fact not capable of marrying her. Come to my side, Jane. Let us explain and understand one another. I will never again come to your side. I am torn away and now and cannot return. But Jane, I summon you as my wife. It is only you I intend to marry. I was silent. I thought he mocked me. Come, Jane, come hither. Your bride stands between us. He rose and with a stride reached me. My bride is here, he said, again drawing me to him, because my equal is here in my likeness, Jane. Will you marry me? Still I did not answer. Still I writhed myself from his grasp, for I was still incredulous. Do you doubt me, Jane? Entirely. You have no faith in me? Not a whit. How Jane ultimately determines whether or not Rochester is sincere is once again to read his face. Mr. Rochester, let me look at your face. Turn to the moonlight. Why? Because I want to read your countenance. Turn. There, you will find it scarcely more legible than a crumpled, scratched page. Read on, only make haste, for I suffer. His face was very much agitated and very much flushed, and there were strong workings in the features and strange gleams in the eyes. And so Jane consents finally to marry him, having been convinced by the look on his face that he truly does love her and is not planning to marry anyone else. Come to me entirely now, said he, and added in his deepest tone, speaking in my ear as his cheek was laid on mine, make my happiness, I will make yours. But then, of course, there is the hidden problem. God pardon me, he subjoined ere long, and man meddle not with me. I have her and will hold her. There is no one to meddle, sir. I have no kindred to interfere. No, that is the best of it, he said. And if I had loved him less, I should have thought his accent and look of exultation savage. So Rochester has determined that he is going to make Jane go through the pretense of marrying him.
In the next and final video, we'll be looking at how Rochester threatens Jane's integrity and why ultimately she has to flee him, and then the mirror image threat posed by St. John, who tries to eliminate her passionate interior in favor of her self-disciplined exterior.